Hello and welcome to this week's Epochs, which will be part one of two, all about the life and times and career and art of Michelangelo Buonarroti, second of the great Italian artistic geniuses. So Michelangelo, a lot like Leonardo, was a master of more than one discipline, a painter, a sculptor, an architect, and even some of his poetry wasn't all that bad, but certainly the three great things, being an architect, a painter and a sculptor. Now, he very much considered himself a sculptor first and foremost. And of course, he is famous for some great paintings, The Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel and the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, of course. Both of those are in the middle and the end of his life, which I'll be speaking about next time. But he didn't really consider himself a great painter, although posterity, history has decided he is, of course. But no, sculpting first and foremost was what he considered himself great at. And he is certainly one of the best to ever do it. Well, I'll come to it later, but the Pietà in St. Peter's I consider one of the greatest sculptures ever done. So, like last time, I was reading a lot from the Lives of Vasari. And I asked you guys for comments or feedback on whether it was too much reading or whether you'd want more reading, whether it was about just right. And the general consensus was that it was fine. There were a few comments saying it was too much. So what I decided I'm going to do is, for this one, for Michelangelo, I'll do about the same amount of reading, again from Vasari's Lives. But for the next topic, where I talk about the Medici family, a couple of centuries plus, I think what I'll do is maybe no quotes, no reading, and just do it entirely in my own words, because it'll be much more of an overview. So I'm going to do it that way, and we'll see how that works out, and you let me know what you prefer. So a quick word on the sources before I jump in. There is Vasari. Now, Vasari knew Michelangelo and very much admired him, looked up to him. Michelangelo lived to be very old. He lived to be 89 years old. And when Vasari wrote his life of Michelangelo, I mean, Vasari even worked on Michelangelo's tomb, considered him a close friend, actually, not just a mentor, but a friend. Michelangelo got to read the first draft, or the first version of Vasari's Lives of himself as a very old man. And he didn't like it particularly. He thought Vasari had underemphasized certain things, or hadn't done him justice, particularly around the issue of the tomb Michelangelo designed and built for Pope Julius II. He wasn't happy with some of the narrative, the way Vasari dealt with some elements of his life. So Michelangelo actually commissioned somebody else to do another biography of him, Ascanio Condivi. And so that was where Michelangelo got Condivi to write another biography that Michelangelo was happy with. Vasari later rewrote his life of Michelangelo, so that it was much more in line with Condivi's account and therefore Michelangelo's wishes. So Vasari's account of Michelangelo's life is a lot longer than Leonardo's one, so I won't be reading nearly all of it, which I did for Leonardo. But remember, though, again, it is a hagiography. It's even more than in the case of Leonardo, in fact. Vasari kind of loved Michelangelo. He absolutely wanted to paint him in the best possible light. And again, he's being paid by the Medici family. So there's a few instances when suddenly we skip ahead a few years and it's just completely omitted. Vasari just completely misses out whole bits of history, really, that are embarrassing to the Medici, or at least don't paint the Medici in the best possible light. So when that happens, I'll sort of just interject and tell you what really happened. So, to begin at the beginning of Michelangelo's life, Vasari tells us this: the benign ruler of heaven, God, graciously looked down to earth, saw the worthlessness of what was being done, the intense but utterly fruitless studies, and the presumption of men who were further from true art than night is from day, and resolved to save us from our errors. So he decided to send into the world an artist who would be skilled in each and every craft, whose work alone would teach us how to attain perfection in design by correct drawing and by the use of contour and light and shadows, and so to obtain relief in painting, and how to use right judgment in sculpture and in architecture. Create buildings which would be comfortable and secure, healthy, pleasant to look at, well proportioned, and richly ornamented. Moreover, he, still talking about God, determined to give this artist the knowledge of true moral philosophy and the gift of poetic expression, so that everyone might admire and follow him as their perfect exemplar in life, work, and behaviour, and in every endeavour. And he would be acclaimed as divine. So there we can see Vasari as not being entirely truthful, because he describes Michelangelo as an exemplar in life, that everyone should follow his behaviour. Michelangelo was quite badly behaved in all sorts of times. There's all sorts of accounts that people aren't being paid to make him look good say that he was very rude and unpleasant and mean and difficult to be around, and even a bit nasty, occasionally sometimes violent. So his life certainly wasn't a perfect example of how everyone should behave. But there you go, we have to be a bit careful with Vasari. Vasari continues, he, God, also saw that in the practice of these exalted disciplines and arts, namely painting, sculpture and architecture, the Tuscan genius has always been preeminent. For the Tuscans have devoted to all the various branches of art more labour and study than all the other Italian peoples. And therefore he chose to have Michelangelo born a Florentine, so that one of her own citizens might bring to absolute perfection the achievements for which Florence was already justly renowned. So Michelangelo was born to a sort of a middling family. They weren't peasants, but they certainly weren't rich. They were of some social standing, but they weren't rich, and that comes up later in life, that most of the money he made, he sort of gave to his family. His father was something of an authoritarian. It seems he did beat Michelangelo sometimes. But the main story is that they had so many children that within a year or two of Michelangelo being born, they gave him to a wet nurse to go and live with another family for like the first 10 years of Michelangelo's life, roughly. And they're sort of very important years, you know. By the time you're 10, you know, your character isn't set or anything, but, you know, your memories have kicked in. It's a really important part of your life. And so the family of this wet nurse were involved in stone cutting, in the business and the art of cutting stone and marble. And apparently this played an important part in Michelangelo's earliest memories. And he's supposed to have said this about it later to a friend. This is an actual quote of Michelangelo. He's supposed to have said, "Giorgio, if my brains are any good at all, it's because I was born in the pure air of your Arezzo countryside. Just as with my mother's milk, I sucked in the hammer and chisels I used for my statues." Obviously as a metaphor. You know, that he was raised on his mother's milk, and the sound of stone, marble being cut, that he breathed in the very marble dust. It's his earliest thing, you know, sort of saying it's in my blood. If I know anything, it's about sculpture and being a sculptor. Michelangelo's father was called Lodovico Buonarroti, and it seems very much like Leonardo's father. He wanted the best for his son, but thought that you know, drawing and painting and being a sculptor is fairly lowly in those times. Even though you could be proclaimed a genius if you were one of the very, very best, usually it was quite a lowly trade. You probably wouldn't make a great deal of money out of it unless you were lucky to get massive commissions and make loads of money out of it. It was a craft. It was just a craft. It was a workmanly thing to do, to be an artist. And Lodovico wanted more for his son than that, and to begin with was sort of aghast that Michelangelo, all he wanted to do was draw. I think of Monty Python and the Holy Grail, you know, where Michelangelo might be like, but father, I just want to draw. And the stern father's like, we'll have none of that. There'll be no drawing in this household. You'll learn a proper trade. But it seems that all Michelangelo wanted to do, was obsessed with, really, in the first instance, was drawing. Because you probably want to be a good draftsman, a good drawer, before you're a sculptor. It comes later. Vasari goes on, as time passed and Lodovico's family grew bigger, he found himself, as he enjoyed only a modest income, in very difficult circumstances, and he had to place his sons, in turn, with the wool and silk guilds. When Michelangelo was old enough, he was sent to the grammar school to be taught by Francesco of Urbino. But he was so obsessed by drawing that he used to spend on it all the time that he possibly could. As a result, he used to be scolded and sometimes beaten by his father and the older members of the family, who most likely considered it unworthy of their ancient house for Michelangelo to give his time to an art which meant nothing to them. But eventually, it became clear to old Lodovico that Michelangelo wouldn't stop drawing. Again, a bit like Leonardo. The boy seemed sort of obsessed with it, almost couldn't stop. He would, skip school, go truant from school just to go to a church and do sketches of the art that he saw. And in the end, the family, it seemed, Lodovico, thought, well, we may as well lean into it. Because, again, like Leonardo, the father saw the drawings the boy was producing, and it was sort of obvious, it was absolutely obvious that he had natural skill, natural talent. So in the end, again, like Leonardo, his father took him to Florence to see if he could get him enrolled in one of the great artistic workshops. And so he was taken to the workshop of Domenico Ghirlandaio, who, like Verrocchio in Leonardo's case, was among the best there was in Florence. So to sort of get him on Ghirlandaio's books was a real boon for the young Michelangelo. And Domenico Ghirlandaio, like Verrocchio, saw the talent in the boy. It was just obvious. Quick thing I must say, because I've made so many parallels there with Leonardo already, is that Michelangelo is 25 odd years younger. So he was born in the mid-70s, the mid-1470s, just a couple of years before Giuliano de' Medici was murdered in the church that time. So Michelangelo was about 2 odd when that happened. So his childhood, or sort of early teenage years in Florence, when he was sort of first trying to come up through the ranks, trying to make his name as a budding artist, or as a budding artist's apprentice, it was the time in Florence when Lorenzo the Magnificent was ruling on his own, the last handful of years of Lorenzo the Magnificent. And Lorenzo the Magnificent was, of course, a great patron of the arts, and he was always on the lookout for any new great talent. And eventually Michelangelo caught his eye. And so Michelangelo's whole life took a turn for the better. So Vasari tells us, quote, "The way Michelangelo's talents and character developed astonished Domenico, who saw him doing things quite out of the ordinary for boys of his age, and not only surpassing his many other pupils, but also very often rivaling the achievements of the master himself. On one occasion, it happened that one of the young men studying with Domenico copied in ink some draped figures of women from Domenico's own work. Michelangelo took what he had drawn and, using a thicker pen, he went over the contours of one of the figures and brought it to perfection. And it is marvellous to see the difference between the two styles and the superior skill and judgment of a young man so spirited and confident that he had the courage to correct what his teacher had done. This drawing is now kept by me among my treasured possessions. I received it from Granaccio, along with other drawings by Michelangelo, for my book of drawings, and in 1550, when I was in Rome, Giorgio Vasari, the author, is referring to himself in the third person, showed it to Michelangelo, who recognised it and was delighted to see it again. Michelangelo would have been very old by that point. He said modestly that as a boy he had known how to draw better than he did now as an old man. That's very interesting. Probably being humble there, but still, some say that some of his earlier work is better than some of the stuff he did in old age. Other people disagree with that. There's another thing I need to say at this point is that the thing about art history, or the appreciation of any art, is that there's not really any right or wrong to it. It's whatever you think, right? It's just your opinion. So I'm going to pass some judgment on some of the art, and some of you out there won't agree with me. There's an old Contemplations I did with Josh where we talked a bit about modern art or some 20th century art, and I was very rude and dismissive of people like Picasso and Rothko. And so I shall have to be careful to rein myself in with gushing about Michelangelo. Now, I won't be as bad as some, because a lot of art historians, they do really gush about Michelangelo. They go, it's over the top, in my opinion. I think he's great. A few of his pieces of work are brilliant, in my opinion. But some people put him on a crazy pedestal, saying he's never been surpassed in any way. Everything he touched was sort of pure liquid genius. I wouldn't necessarily go that far, but yeah, I mean, I remember seeing the great art historian Brian Saul bring himself to tears looking at some of Michelangelo's sculptures. It is great stuff, but you can get carried away. I was watching a documentary just the other day for this, and one of the art historians was saying they have to remind himself that Michelangelo was in fact a man. Like, calm down, get some perspective. It's good, but be careful. He was just a man, very, very human in all sorts of ways. Vasari goes on. Another time, when Domenico was working on the principal chapel of Santa Maria Novella, Michelangelo came along and started to draw the scaffolding and trestles and various implements and materials, as well as some of the young men who were busy there. When Domenico came back and saw what Michelangelo had done, he said, "This boy knows more about it than I do." And he stood there astonished at the originality and skill in imitation that his inborn sense of judgment enabled so young an artist to display. Certainly the work showed all the qualities to be expected of an artist with years of experience. This was because the instinctive grace of Michelangelo's work was enhanced by study and practice, and every day he produced work that was still more inspired. For example, it was at this time that he made the copy of an engraving by Martin the German that brought him considerable fame. Michelangelo did a perfect pen and ink copy of this copper engraving, which showed St. Anthony being tormented by devils, soon after it had been brought to Florence. Michelangelo did a perfect pen and ink copy of this copper engraving, which still survives, so I'll put a picture up, some crazy, horrible demon creatures, which showed St. Anthony being tormented by devils soon after it had been brought to Florence. He also did the scene in colours, and for this purpose, in order to copy some of the strange-looking demons in the picture, he went along to the market and brought some fishes with fantastic scales like theirs. The skill with which he did this work won him a considerable reputation. So he's still a boy, really. He's still a young teenager. He must be under 15 at this point. So this was the first work where the boy Michelangelo, still a young teenager, he must have been under 15, all sorts of adults outside of his school first took notice. This boy's not just talented, he's not just a diamond in the rough, he's actually already really good. Okay, considerable reputation. Vasari continues. Michelangelo also copied the works of other masters with complete fidelity. He used to tinge his copies and make them appear black with age by various means, including the use of smoke, so that they could not be told apart from the originals. He did this so that he could exchange his copies for the originals, which he admired for their excellence, and which he tried to surpass in his own works, and these experiments also won him fame. At this time, the custodian or keeper of all the fine antiquities that Lorenzo the Magnificent had collected at great expense and kept in his garden on the Piazza di San Marco was the sculptor Bertoldo. He had been a pupil of Donatello's, and the chief reason why Lorenzo kept him in his service was because he had set his heart on establishing a school of first-rate painters and sculptors, and wanted Bertoldo to teach and look after them. Bertoldo was now too old to work. Nevertheless, he was very experienced and very famous, not only for having polished the bronze pulpits cast by Donatello, but also for the many bronze casts of battle scenes and the other small things he had executed himself with a competence that no one else in Florence could rival. So Lorenzo, who was an enthusiastic lover of painting and sculpture, regretting that he could find no great and noble sculptors to compare with the many contemporary painters of ability and repute, determined, as I said, to found a school himself. For this reason, he told Domenico Ghirlandaio that if he had in his workshop any young men who were drawn to sculpture, he should send them along to his garden, where they would be trained and formed in a manner that would do honour to himself, to Domenico, and to the whole city. So, Lorenzo the Magnificent has got a garden in his palace, in the palace of the Medici. And this garden served as some sort of workshop, some sort of the Medici's own workshop, particularly for sculpture. So Vasari tells us, quote, "So Domenico gave him some of the best among his young men, including Michelangelo and Francesco Granacci. And when they arrived at the garden, they found Torrigiano working there on some clay figures in the round that Bertoldo had given him to do. After he had seen these figures, Michelangelo was prompted to make some himself. And when he saw the boy's ambitious nature, Lorenzo started to have very high hopes of what he would do. Michelangelo was so encouraged that some days later he set himself to copy in marble an antique fawn's head which he found in the garden. It was very old and wrinkled, with some nose damage and a laughing mouth. Although this was the first time he had ever touched a chisel or worked in marble, Michelangelo succeeded in copying it so well that Lorenzo was flabbergasted. Then, when he saw that Michelangelo had departed a little from the model and followed his own fancy in hollowing out a mouth for the fawn and giving it a tongue and all its teeth, Lorenzo laughed in his usual charming way and said, "But you should have known that old folk never have all their teeth, and there are always some missing." In his simplicity, Michelangelo, who loved and feared that lord, reflected that this was true, and as soon as Lorenzo had gone, he broke one of the fawn's teeth and dug it into the gum so that it looked as if the tooth had fallen out. Then he waited anxiously for Lorenzo to come back, and after he had seen the result of Michelangelo's simplicity and skill, Lorenzo laughed at the incident more than once and used to tell it for a marvel to his friends. He resolved that he would help and favour the young Michelangelo, and first he sent for his father, Lodovico, and asked whether he could have the boy, adding that he wanted to keep him as one of his own sons. Lodovico willingly agreed, and then Lorenzo arranged to have Michelangelo given a room of his own and looked after as one of the Medici household. Michelangelo always ate at Lorenzo's table and with the sons of the family and other distinguished and noble persons who lived with that lord, and Lorenzo always treated him with great respect. All this happened the year after Michelangelo had been placed with Domenico, when he was 15 or 16 years old, and he lived in the Medici house for 4 years until the death of Lorenzo the Magnificent in 1492. So I have to mention here, some great things have happened to Michelangelo in that time. So he's only really spent about a year in Florence learning the trade, various things, drawing, painting, the rudiments of architecture, the rudiments of fresco painting, and again, the rudiments of sculpting. And within a year, he's caught the eye of Lorenzo the Magnificent, the most powerful man in Florence by far, among the most powerful people in all of Italy, among the most powerful and rich people in Europe. The Medici family, by this point, were great bankers for all of Europe. They were fantastically rich. Fantastically rich. So, to catch the eye of Lorenzo the Magnificent is sort of an incredible, amazing thing. But not just to catch his eye. Remember what I just said there. Lorenzo sort of adopts Michelangelo. He actually sort of adopts him and raises him as a son on some level. And Lorenzo's got a son and a nephew, the son of his murdered brother, that are about the same age as Michelangelo. One's a year or two older, one's a year or two younger. And it's Giovanni de' Medici and Giulio de' Medici. And so for a good 4 years there, again, in their formative years, as sort of teenagers, Michelangelo's raised with them as a type of surrogate brother or stepbrother or something. Both those Medici boys go on to become popes. So Michelangelo's connections are very, very, very good. But when Lorenzo dies, he gets a disease, dies of natural causes. Surprisingly, it's lucky he didn't get himself assassinated. But when Lorenzo the Magnificent dies of natural causes, everything changes. The very politics of Florence are turned upside down. And Vasari doesn't really tell us any of that because it's a bit embarrassing to the Medici story. So I have to break off from Vasari for a while and talk about the fact that, which I mentioned in the Leonardo one, that after Lorenzo dies, there's a period of sort of anarchy to begin with. So there is the period of the rule, in inverted commas, by the Friar Savonarola, the bonfire of the vanities, when the decadence of the age of Lorenzo is sort of turned upside down. And Michelangelo would have known that he wouldn't have been particularly welcome in Florence when it was being run by Savonarola. But I'll cut back to Vasari at this point, who continues, "As a matter of fact, all the young men in the garden were paid salaries varying in amount through the generosity of that noble and magnificent citizen who supported them as long as he lived. It was at this time that, with advice from Politian, a distinguished man of letters, Michelangelo carved from a piece of marble given him by Lorenzo the Battle of Hercules with the centaurs." Again, still survives, so I can show you that. "This was so beautiful that today, to those who study it, it sometimes seems to be the work of not a young man, but of a great master with a wealth of study and experience behind him. It is now kept in memory of Michelangelo by his nephew Leonardo, who cherishes it as a rare work of art. Not many years ago, Leonardo also, the nephew Leonardo, not Leonardo da Vinci, Leonardo also kept in his house, in memory of his uncle, a marble Madonna in bas relief, little more than 2 feet high. This was executed by Michelangelo when he was still a young man, after the style of Donatello's, and he acquitted himself so well that it seems to be by Donatello himself, save that it possesses more grace and design. Leonardo subsequently gave this work to Duke Cosimo de' Medici, who regards it as unique, since it is the only sculpture in bas relief left by Michelangelo." To return to the garden of Lorenzo the Magnificent, this place was full of antiques and richly furnished with excellent pictures collected for their beauty and for study and pleasure. Michelangelo always held the keys to the garden, as he was far more earnest than the others and always alert, bold, and resolute in everything he did. For example, he spent many months in the Church of the Carmine, making drawings from the pictures of Masaccio. He copied these with such judgment that the craftsmen and all the others who saw his work were astonished, and he then started to experience envy as well as fame. It is said that Torrigiano, who had struck up a friendship with Michelangelo, then became jealous on seeing him more honoured than himself and more able in his work. At length, Torrigiano started to mock him, and then he hit him on the nose so hard that he broke and crushed it, and marked Michelangelo for life. Because of this, Torrigiano, as I describe elsewhere, was banished from Florence. So that's something to note there. Vasari makes out in that Michelangelo did nothing wrong. But using other accounts and other stories, it seems that Michelangelo, to put it mildly, gave as good as he got. He was argumentative. He was brash and rude and argumentative. And eventually, if you do that enough, you'll come up against someone that won't have it, and he got thumped in the face. And it broke his nose. Now, there's broken noses and there's broken noses. sometimes when if you break your nose badly, it's sort of, your nose is forever at a weird angle. You might be able to have it rebroken these days, and there's all sorts of things you could do these days, but in the 15th, 16th century, if you had a sort of a badly broken nose, you were sort of a tiny bit disfigured. I mean, that might be putting it a bit strongly, but anyway, we know from Michelangelo's letters, because lots of his letters survive, lots of his writings, his poems and letters to all sorts of people survive. And we know for a fact that Michelangelo was very, very conscious of his ever so slightly disfigured, broken nose, and that he thought himself from that point onwards imperfect. Everyone agrees that Michelangelo loved beautiful things. He was sort of in love with anything beautiful, and Michelangelo himself wasn't beautiful. He was a very average looking man to begin with, perhaps even slightly ugly. Certainly wasn't particularly handsome or dashing. Also, with this broken nose, which he seems to have blown up in his own mind, no one remarks that he had a terribly disfigured nose or anything, but in his own mind, he was sort of disfigured, and he didn't like going out in public all that much. He didn't like massive groups of people. He was quite self-conscious, and he was sort of terribly disappointed that he himself was semi-ugly. Now that's a bit of a burden to carry around, and it seemed it did kind of haunt Michelangelo on some level the rest of his life. Doesn't sound like much, but luckily I'm not scarred on the face. Well, I think of Henry V, King Henry V of England, took an arrow in the face as a young man. He was about 15 or 16. He got shot in the face by an arrow, and they had to take it out, and he left him with a big scar on his face. He was very, very self-conscious of that for the rest of his days, and tried to always just show one side of his face, the unscarred side of his face, a lot. And was just really self-conscious of it. And it's sad, really, isn't it? It's really sad.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.